Hello, everybody. I'm Jonathan Melma, otherwise known as Dews, and welcome to the first episode of the Sidecast. Today, we will be going over pitching advanced metrics, and I'll be just explaining them to you guys so that in future videos or on the podcast, you guys will be more aware of the metrics and you'll hopefully understand them and understand what we're talking about a little bit more. So let's get right into it. First off, we have adjusted earned run average, otherwise known as ERA plus or adjusted ERA. ERA plus takes a player's ERA and normalizes it across the entire league. This takes into account different things like the ballparks, say Coors Field, which is a really high run environment, or Comerica, which is just spacious, or even Yankee Stadium, which is smaller. So it's able to adjust for the ballpark and the opponents that are played, and it adjusts it to a score of 100 as average for the league. So somebody who is a 150 ERA plus would be 50% better than the league average, or 50 would be 50% worse than the average pitcher. This also allows us to compare across multiple years for pitchers, with 100 always being average. You're really able to see how dominant or not dominant a pitcher was based off of the average for that year. So you can compare guys from the 1920s to guys in the 2020s just based off of this stat. So in doing that, it just levels the playing field and adjusts pitchers more truly to the benefit that they give to their team and not just the benefit they're able to give their team in that specific ballpark. So it's also very useful for getting pitchers from one team and kind of seeing how they would play in another park because it uses an averaged park. So next up is fielding independent pitching, otherwise known as FIP. You have definitely heard Justin and I use this in the podcast, especially the pitching episode. So make sure to check that out in the card. And FIP focuses solely on the events that a pitcher can control most, like strikeouts, walks, hit by pitches, and home runs. It does not take into consideration any balls hit into the field of play, as the pitcher is not able to control where fielders line up or how fielders play the ball. So it more so tries to just quantify and normalize just what the pitcher is able to control, and it aims to be an alternative to ERA in that sort, just off of projections. It's not perfect, but it is still a very useful tool, and I will use it a lot. XFIP, also known as expected fielding independent pitching, is very similar to FIP. It uses the same items as FIP, except for it uses the projected home run rate instead of the actual home runs allowed. So a home run is determined by that season for XFIP is determined by the season's league average home run to fly ball rate and is predicted on the notion that pitchers have more control over how many fly balls that they allowed more than the fly balls that leave the park. So as a result, XFIP substitutes a pitcher's home tally with an estimation of how many home runs a pitcher would have permitted given the number of fly balls that they introduced. So a pitcher who introduces 12 fly balls is going to have a higher xFIP than a pitcher who allows 3 fly balls, even if 2 of those are home runs, just because the pitcher is allowing more fly balls, so it's expected that more are going to leave the park. And finally, we have SIERA, which is Skill Interactive Earned Run Average. And this qualifies a pitcher's performance by trying to eliminate factors that the pitcher can't control by himself, very similar to FIP here. But unlike XFIP and FIP, SIERA considers balls that are in play and adjusts for the type of ball in play. So for example, if a pitcher has a high xFIP, but has also induced a high proportion of grounders and pop-ups instead of line drives, then SIERA will be lower than xFIP. the differentiation between a pop-up fly ball, line driving ground ball is a fly ball is a ball that is hit to the outfield in the air. That is not considered a line drive, whereas a pop-up is only to the infield. Of course, a ground ball is a ball headed along the ground.
Hey, it's editing Jonathan here. I just realized I never actually told you guys what line drive was, like what differentiated it in this. So Fangraphs says that a line drive is bad ball that is has a launch angle between 8 and 20 or 25 degrees. These would include liners or ropes, and typically when batters hit this kind of a ball, they will reach base about 70% of the time. Whereas on ground balls and fly balls is normally about 25% of the time. So sorry about that. And now back to the rest of the video.
So you can use these rates for the pop-up rate, the fly ball rate, line drive rate, ground ball rate, all of these to see how good a pitcher is at inducing different kinds of contact. So a lot of pitchers, besides trying to be a power pitcher and a strikeout guy, you will see guys try to be ground ball pitchers because ground balls don't normally lead to a lot of runs. Fly balls can because of home runs and extra base hits, or line drives also can, but that's what you'll kind of see here. Whiff percentage is how often a pitcher will throw a pitch that a batter will swing and miss at, how often they induce a swing and a miss. So that is useful to know. Normally, this is done by pitch. So you can look at somebody's four-seam fastball, see how high their whiff rate is on that versus another person's, or it's like sliders and curveballs tend to be your higher whiff pitches just because of the movement on them. A lot of your breaking balls, your off speed. But even fastballs, depending on how quick they are and where they're located in the spin rate, can be a really high whiff pitch. So that is always very useful to know and to look into. And you also can look at what should a pitcher be throwing a bit more of, with the caveat to that being if they start throwing it more, will guys stop whiffing at it as much maybe. So it's a little bit of a balancing act, but you'll be able to find there are certain pitches that guys throw that they should not be throwing because they just get hit constantly. Granted, they might be a ground ball pitcher where they're trying to induce weak contact on the bottom of the zone for a ground out. And in that case, you're fine with it not being a high whiff rate pitch. But for guys who are more power pitchers and are looking for strikeouts, especially your flame throwing relievers, you want a high whiff rate on those pitches. And if there's a low whiff rate, maybe they don't throw it as much, just to, limit the damage that's able to be done with that pitch, against the team. So next up is hits per nine, and that's abbreviated with the H9 or the H over nine. But hits per nine represents the average number of hits that a pitcher will allow during 9 innings if they were to pitch an entire game. So this is solely based on the number of outs that a pitcher records rather than the number of at-bats for the opponents. So if you go through the entire lineup in 1 inning and only get 3 outs during that, that will drastically increase your hits per nine score versus if only go through 4. Granted, you're also probably allowing a lot more hits during that, but it is not set to a certain amount of batters per inning. It is all based on outs that a pitcher gets. This is also important because hits per nine does take into account the second out of double plays and sacrifices along with other outs like pickoff moves or outfield assists. Walks, hit by pitches, and errors do not factor into hits per nine because they are not a method of hits. Only hits do, of course. But that is very important to have that distinction between what is and what isn't counted in this metric. Next up, we have home run per nine. This is very similar to the hits per nine, and it's just the average number of home runs allowed per 9 innings. Again, based off of the amount, like the outs that that a pitcher gets. And finally, we have home run to fly ball rate, also known as home run to fly ball percentage. And that's the percentage of pitchers' fly balls that will become home runs. So this kind of factors into the fly ball rate and the FIP and the xFIP. So hopefully you have a really low home run to fly ball rate. And that's good because there are certain pitchers who are fly ball pitchers. If you have a really high home run to fly ball rate, that's not good at all. But it's calculated as how many home runs to fly balls there are, even though there are home runs that are line drives, primarily it will be a fly ball that ends up being a home run. Next up, we have our strikeout rate, and that one's pretty self-explanatory. It's just the frequency in which a pitcher will strike out a batter, calculated as strikeouts divided by batters faced. You have strikeouts per nine, which, similar to your other per nine stats, is how many strikeouts a pitcher will get over the course of 9 innings if they pitch the entire 9 innings, determined by outs. And it's calculated by strikeouts divided by the total number of batters based in that span of those outs. So strikeout to walk rate is strikeouts divided by walks. And this will tell you how good a pitcher is at striking out guys and limiting their walks. So this is just a core tool for evaluating pitchers, and it shows a lot of command, especially with power pitchers who typically are going to strike out more guys. But this is very, very good at being able to see, okay, is this guy just a flamethrower who's able to strike out guys, or can he also limit the amount of walks and really control where he's throwing the pitches? Similarly, you have walk rate, which just looks at how many walks are issued during the batters that they face. So if they face 5 batters, and you have one guy walked, then it's 20% walk rate. So walks per 9 inning, again, similar to the other per 9 stats, is how often or how many times do you walk batters during a 9 inning outing if you were to pitch the entire 9 innings? Is calculated the same as all the others. So it's walks divided by the number of batters faced during those 9 innings, which are done by outs. Finally, we have our reliever specific metrics and leverage index, which measures the importance of a particular event by quantifying the extent to which the win probability could change on said event, with 1 representing a neutral situation. With leverage index, most of your game situations are less than 1% or less than 1. About 60% of game decisions or game situations are less than 1. There are only about 10% of real game situations that are greater than a 2 on that. So that kind of shows where a lot of it lives. Most are below 1, and then about 30% of the remaining is in between 1 and 2. So 2 and above would be a really high leverage situation. So for a high leverage situation above 2, which this would be way above 2, but think bases loaded with 0 outs in the 9th inning of a tie game. So that right there would be a very high leverage situation, especially if you were the away team, because that would mean that all the home team would have to do is score that run from third to win the game. So that would be a very high leverage situation, and a situation where you're not necessarily expected to get out of it, but there are guys who will get out of it. So it's just how much stress basically, and how much of how hard is it to get out of this jam really is what the leverage index is going to be best for. So next we have inherited runs allowed. And this is when a relief pitcher comes in, say there are 2 guys on base, they inherit those runners. And if they allow them to score, the runs go against the ERA of the pitcher prior to them because they allowed them on base. It doesn't hurt the reliever, but this stat of the inherited runs allowed does actually factor in how much it hurts the team, because it looks at how well the reliever essentially does his job of stopping the bleeding when they come in. So, optimally, you don't want them to score any runs off of it, but certain guys are going to be better at that than others. This also factors in slightly with your leverage index. But this doesn't factor into the calculation of leverage index, but they kind of go hand in hand. The more runs on base that you inherit, the higher your leverage index is going to be most of the time, depending on the situation of game. But yeah, this basically is just a stat that will penalize bad relievers, or relievers who come in these spots where they normally wouldn't be charged with any runs. It is a negative stat for them when they cannot stop the bleeding. Finally, we have clutch, which is calculated with the difference in the player's total win probability added, which I will get into a little bit in the next video. But basically, win probability added is how much an individual play factors into the outcome of the game. Again, I will dive into it a little bit more in the batting episode of the sidecast coming up. But yeah, so how much does a certain play or a certain string of plays factor into the total win probability of the game for a team? So you take that and you divide it by the leverage index, and that ends up finding out how clutch a player is. The worse that they do, the lower their score. The better they do, the better their score. So just the better that a player does at, in high leverage situations at being that shutdown pitcher in this case, is how you determine clutch. So 0 is average for this, 0.5 is above average, great is 1, and excellent is 2. There aren't very many people who will get above a 1 or go below a -1. But it's a even scale on both sides, essentially, with 2 being where excellent and awful is, both positive and negative, and barely anybody getting above that. Most are in the middle between 1 and -1. With that being said, thank you guys for watching. I hope that you guys were able to learn something in this video, and I hope that this is able to help you guys understand what Justin and I are talking about in the future, and especially what I will be talking about in the future. And if you guys learned something, please like the video. It helps us out a ton. Make sure to share with your friends and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.